This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you for joining us for When a Disaster Affects Your Practice. This is part one of a three-part series. Part one covers cybersecurity and earthquakes. My name is Phoebe James and I'm a Professional Development Officer with the PHN, and I will now hand over to John Bailey, our Executive Manager for Primary Care Improvement. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Phoebe, and welcome everyone. Welcome to the first in our series on when a disaster affects your practice. I'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting. I'm here on Wanneroo land in Maitland, but I welcome you from whatever country you are on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is the first of a couple of webinars that we have on when disaster affects your practice, and really good to have John Goswell, Peter Mullen and Ellen along from our disaster emergency management team to lead us through this tonight. Unfortunately, I'm double booked, so I'm just going to welcome you, and now I'm going to disappear. So have a great night. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. And welcome everybody to the first of our trilogy session. We have the first event on tonight, and Peter will be the first one to present tonight. So I will hand over to Peter, who will cover the topic cybersecurity. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen. Okay. Just share my screen. Phoebe, can you confirm you can see that in presentation mode? Excellent.
Correct.
Okay. Bear with me, and I'm just also going to toggle my screen because I've lost what I was looking at. There we go. Okay. Alrighty, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners on the lands which meet. I'm in Warramai country here in beautiful Port Stephens, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So my part that I'm going to talk about tonight is the cybersecurity and data security side of things. We're going to look at it primarily in a fairly broad brush way. Before I get into it though, I'd like to cover a little bit of background about why we're looking at this and why it's such an important topic. Last year, the PHN commissioned a company, Semantic Consulting, to conduct a what we call the Healthy Together Digital Care Survey for general practice. We've also done another one this year in allied health, but we haven't got the reports on that at the moment. It's currently in the reporting phase. So the statistics that I talk about tonight will be primarily general practice based. But we did that. Why we did the survey was we knew that there was a wide range of digital uptake and digital knowledge across our footprint, but we wanted to be able to quantify that and work out where the gaps were so we can focus on areas to better improve the knowledge and better improve the uptake across our footprint. So the survey was 40 online targeted questions, including some free text responses. I've covered why we ran the survey, so we've done that bit. Who participated? We had 211 of the 382 practices at the time across our area do the response. 206 provided responses, and it was typically completed by practice owners or practice managers. So that was what we did. What we learned, and one of the critical things coming back in the report that was noted by the consultant, was that critical work is required on cybersecurity and disaster recovery. Knowledge and practice about cybersecurity disaster recovery continues to be problematic and requires specific attention to address those critical vulnerabilities. So that's obviously why we're doing what we're doing tonight, and we've done a few other sessions along the way as well. So let's just have a look at and talk about data security. Why is it a threat? Why the health industry in particular? Cyber attacks are continually on the rise. A lot of people tend to think of, cyber criminals as the picture looks there, someone sitting in a hoodie at home, lonely old person sitting there, tapping away at their laptop overnight. It's not. It is big business. It's actually organised crime. And in some cases, cybersecurity is even state-sponsored. So it's here to stay, and it's just growing each year on itself, it's just it's just really taking off. Why health in particular? If you look at, say, a credit card on the dark web, value of a credit card with full details about $5. If you've got a health file, that's somewhere up around $1,000. And the reason for the difference between the two is simply the value of that information. If you've got a credit card, you might get a few transactions done before the credit card provider picks it up or the owner picks it up. If you've got a health file, with the information containing that, you can pretty much just about create your own identification. Then you can go and get, do your own loans and things like that. So you can actually steal identities with a health file. So that's why the value of it's a lot dearer. And also it's much more emotive in the possession of that data. We saw that last year with the Medibank private data breach and the holding it for ransom and things like that. That created a whole lot of emotion and a whole lot of angst right across the whole country. So health data is very valuable, and that's why they're targeting it. Don't think if you're out there in a small practice that they're not after us, they're just after the big fish. You've only got to look back a couple of months ago here in the Hunter area. We had break-ins in practices where they actually targeted servers and IT equipment. So it's not just big business that they're looking at. Small practices are also targets as well. So it's really valuable that everybody, does what they can to prevent those breaches and contain them when if they happen. So this information that I've got up here at the moment, this is the top 5 sectors of data breaches. So this is notifiable data breaches to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. This is July to December 22 information. You can see health service providers, the highest number of breaches. So we're winning. Not a good stat. That's one we don't want to be winning. Closely followed by finance and insurance. But it just shows again that health is an area that is subject to data breaches, so it's a target. This is information from July to December 2021. So we're going back a further 12 months. And you can see there that malicious or criminal attacks were 55%, system fault 4%, human error 41%. We'll talk a little bit about human error again shortly. But when we jump forward 12 months, you can see that malicious or criminal attack is up to 70%. So it's grown, human error is down, and system fault is up a little bit as well. What we're seeing there is probably not so much a drop in the human error, it's an increase in the malicious or criminal attacks. So that's what we're seeing. It is on the rise, and it's not going away. It's something we just need to all look at and address and make sure we're covered. So just looking here, this information again from the OAIC, July to December 2022, what we're looking at is the ransomware is 29%. Of the other compromised, stolen credentials, phishing, brute force attack, hacking or malware, that makes up 71%. So let's have a little bit of a look in that area and just see what that comprises and what we can do to prevent that happening. So as I said, 71% made up of phishing. Phishing is just, where you get a spoof email, it's pretending to be something else and you click on a link and it's not what you expect it to be. And it's taking you, might download code onto your computer or it might take you to a fake website, which tricks you to put in information. Malware, again, something that might be a tracker on your computer, keystroke tracker or something like that. Brute force attack is that bank of computers just forcing and trying credentials to actually force in a way into your system. And again, compromised or stolen credentials, again, through various methods. So they're the ways that, that cyber criminals are looking to gain that information and gain access to your data. So how do you mitigate that? Web filtering, so making sure that your web browser and your security software that's running is actually looking for whether that site has got a security certificate, what's the bona fides of that site, and blocking those dangerous sites. Same with email filtering, making sure that your email system is up to scratch, that it's got a good filter on it, and it's looking for those things that might be malicious and either quarantining them or putting them into a junk folder so that they're flagged and that they're harder to access and harder to actually do the wrong thing with them. Strong password policies, and I'm going to cover that a little bit more as well. Multi-factor authentication, again, what are your logins like? Do you need a token to get in? Do you need a password? Is there a second factor authentication, whether that's a certificate, a authenticator app or something like that? All of those things help protect your data and your access to your system. And if all else fails, your business continuity and your disaster recovery plan are integral. And we'll talk about those and what are the things. And we've got some templates. Ellen's got a template that I think we're going to share at the end of this presentation. So talk about passwords. these are the top 30 most passwords. I actually did threw this into ChatGPT the other night. They haven't changed, believe it or not. These came out in about 2021. They're still the top 30 passwords that are being used everywhere. Password is not a password. Password one is not a password, and neither is anything in that picture. So if you're using any of those, stop, have a look at what you're doing and really reassess what you're doing. And it may not be you, it may be someone across the practice, and it's a matter of knowing who's doing what and setting standards across the practice. What does your policy and procedure say? What does your password policy say? And do you give them a way of actually managing those passwords? Why is it important to have complex password? We look here at complex passwords, and you can see if you've got just an 8-digit numbers only, it's going to take a brute force attack it's going to crack it instantly. Even if you've got 9 characters with a mix of uppercase and lowercase letters, it's going to take 19 hours. So the more complex you've got that password, the harder it's going to be. Now, best case scenario, you have a completely random password of 10 plus digits, and you can see there it's going to take some time to break into it. But you really need to be looking at complex passwords. I know that's difficult in the average situation, but here's a couple of examples. You don't need to, you can use, we talk about using passphrases instead of using a password. Now, you can, instead of using real names or real nouns, you can mix that up, change letters for symbols, but it might be something you can remember. Again, but everybody should have different passwords, so everybody should be remembering their own. Best case scenario, though, use a password manager. There's a number of them out there on the market. They're built, you can get them built for enterprise use, so you can use them across the practice, and that way, passwords are already automatically managed. You can generate random passwords, and you don't have to be remembering passwords. I see it so often, and part of the response was that 40% of practices that did the survey actually told us that they were using sticky notes, a notebook stuck in the top drawer with their passwords because they can't remember them. That's why it's important. Good example about why we don't use passwords and why we don't use sticky notes. This fine-looking gentleman worked for the Hawaiian Emergency Agency. Back in 2018, they actually broadcast a fake nuclear attack. But that wasn't the reason why he ended up in a bit of trouble. Here he is being interviewed after the event. And if we look a little bit closer, the more astute people noticed that there was a sticky note stuck on his monitor. Yes, it was his password. We can see there it's warning point +2. So this is why it's important. If you've got your passwords stuck on monitors or on hard drives or anything like that, if you get a break-in, physical break-in, the criminals have already got access to your system. One question you possibly need to ask is that negligence, and is that going to void any insurance? So it's really critical that you make it as hard as possible for people to be able to gain access to your system. So as I say, use password managers. A number of them are out there. There's LastPass, NordPass, RoboForm, OnePass, MyGlue. Find the one that works best for you, and look at using that. I'll jump away from passwords now and get off my soapbox. Ransomware. So ransomware, a little bit different. This is what we saw with the Medibank Private attack. They actually had their data hacked, and then they locked up their data. And so that's what a ransomware attack is. They put something onto your system. It will eventually lock your system. It may not be straight away. Part of the smart malware will actually delay the actual deployment of the malware. So what it'll do is just wait till you do a backup. Then your backup's compromised as well, so your backup is actually lost. So it's not a way of recovering your data and actually restarting again. So beware of ransomware. Again, how do we mitigate that? Same sorts of things. It's web filtering, it's email filtering, it's application whitelisting. So only having applications, only allowing your system to run applications that are actually whitelisted. That is, they've got the right permissions to run. If an application doesn't have the right permissions to run, the system blocks it. And again, your business continuity and your disaster recovery plan, if something goes pear-shaped, that's critical to have that in place. One other thing is the Australian Cybersecurity Council, along with the government and everyone else, recommends if you do suffer a malware attack, you don't pay the ransomware. Because the simple thing is, you've got no guarantee you're going to actually get your data back, or that they're not going to ask for more money, and it's just an ongoing cycle. So yeah, don't pay. The sectors for this that where ransomware hit last time: education and training. So some of the big universities got hit. Info and media and telecom. The good thing is their health came last, but as I said, we're a target. You've got to be aware, and Medicare, Medibank Private again was a classic example of that. So data security, what can you do about it? Well, let's firstly make sure you're running secure software, security software. Make sure it's enterprise level. It's got to be fit for purpose, and it's got to be updated. There's no point running the software and not running the patches or updates. So it's got the latest virus definitions and everything else. Secure messaging. So if you're sending sending patient data between providers, again, how are you sending that? Are you using secure messaging like Medical Objects, HealthLink, Argus, one of those systems, or are you using encrypted referrals? Plug for Send referrals here for those practices in the Hunter New England region. It's very secure. All of those things, they encrypt the information and they send them point to point. Emails are not secure for sending patient information or secure data. They're too easily hacked and they're too easily sent to the wrong person. Emails autofill, and you might send it to John Smith and it might go to John Brown. So it's too easy to send that patient information. Even the RHCGP guidelines say you really shouldn't be using email. It's high risk, only if it's encrypted and only if you've actually consented your patient. And I know from experience that's not what happens in most practices. Fax or e-fax, again, slightly more secure, but faxes are being used as e-fax hacking is actually becoming more prevalent, and it's being used as a back way into your system. The other thing to remember when you're using an e-fax system, most of them actually rely on email for the transit of the actual document once it comes in or leaves your practice. So it might go between venues or between offices as a fax, but when it comes in, your fax software converts it to a PDF, shoots it into your email system, sends it up if you're using an Office 365 environment, sends it up to Microsoft servers, brings it back down and pops it in your inbox. So you're actually emailing your faxes, and the reverse happens on the way out. So e-faxes are actually using email as a protocol, and actually GoFax, I know, I'm not sure if it's still the case, but they usually used to store all of your faxes on their servers unless you ask them to delete them. So if you're using GoFax, that might be something to look at as well. IT hygiene. So what does your practice policy again say about bringing other mediums, USBs and other mediums in and plugging them into your computers? Your policy should say no external devices or anything to be connected, because that's a way, again, of bringing in something unwanted. If somebody's not running the same level of security, if you've got somebody running Windows 8 at home with a free AVG security software, chances are they're probably bringing something onto your system that you don't want. And I mentioned staff training. Staff really should be trained regularly on what's happening, what are the current trends. Get them thinking about cybersecurity. It should be second nature. Do they know to hover over a link and that'll actually pop up and show them the actual destination of where that link is going to go before they click on it? There's a lot of training around. The Australian Digital Health Agency has training. Make that training regular and ongoing. Make sure they're looking at, but also make it part of your induction. So you set a baseline knowledge level within the practice so that your staff know what's going on there. Little plug, and I'll mention it again later, but I believe the PHN is also developing some training on cybersecurity and data security. So keep your eyes open for that one. That'll come out very soon, I believe. Secure Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP. Again, a lot of us are working from home. A lot of us are remoting into our systems. So you need to look at your RDP protocol. Is it password protected? Is it through a VPN? Are you using multi-factor authentication? And does it block the number of login attempts? Again, RDP is a way that cyber criminals are looking to get into your system. It's a backdoor in, and if they do a brute force attempt, you want it to actually block it after 3 attempts. You don't want it just to continue on so that they can actually continue access to that. So have a look at that. Make sure if your staff are RDPing in, that you actually know what they're doing. Potentially also, is their own asset that they're using, if they're using their own assets, again, are they running that Windows 8 home and they haven't updated since then and running freeware, or have they got any security software on? Because that could be the weakest point into your system. So again, using your own assets is preferred to using people's individual assets. User permissions are very important. Again, they've got to allow staff to work effectively within their job scope, but you don't want people to be able to install programs if they don't need that permission, or bring other programs or software onto your system, because you don't know what that's going to do and where it's come from. So you need to have a look at who's got administrator level access, who doesn't, and make sure that actually fits with the job scope. Software, make sure again and again, this should be your IT supplier or your managed service provider, but keep all your software up to date. Make sure it's running the latest version. Make sure you don't delay upgrades, whether that's your clinical management system, your operating system, your BIOS, your drivers. Make sure they're updated, because that's where you get those security patches, and that blocks the latest threats. Backups, again, critical. You've got to do them daily. Doesn't matter what you're backing up, it's got to be done daily, and it's got to be stored off-site. Doesn't matter whether it's going to cloud storage or a physical drive, as long as it's happening and as long as it's actually being taken off-site. If you're using a physical drive, I always reckon you should be using 3, one on, one off with the latest backup, and one as a backup drive, because if that one that's on fails, the last thing you want to be doing is putting your last full backup on to be overwritten and finding out that's failed as well, and you actually don't have a backup. So 3 drives if you're using a physical one. And again, if they're going off-site, where are they going? How are they being handled? Are they being left in the car, sitting in the car park, or are they actually being looked after securely? The other thing is to make sure you know what's being backed up. Is your clinical management system being backed up? Yes, great. But what about your own files? Your backups for your accounting file software, all of your files, your policies, procedures, all of those sort of physical files that you've got there. Are they being backed up? Where are they being stored? Some backup systems may not be looking on a user's desktop or in their documents folder. That may get missed. So if they're not looking, if you've got shared drives, make sure people are storing them in the correct place, not in a file that's not being backed up, because that's a good way to lose something. I've put their secondary server. If you're looking at upgrading your server, and the old one still works, it's an option there to actually use that as a secondary server. That can be written too. We had one in our practice. We backed up to the secondary server, and it ran about 15 minutes behind the actual server. So it meant that if we had a server failure on our primary server, we actually had a backup and we could get up and running fairly quickly. And there, the last one is critical. I've mentioned it before. Have you tested your data recovery from your backup? Make sure your IT provider can actually do what they say they can do. It's no good they give you a contract that says we can do this. You should be backing that up. Recovering from that backup and making sure that actually works at least once a year, and making sure what you think you're going to get is what you get. Policy and procedures, I mentioned those. Again, they're living documents. You need to be making sure that that's actually, it's great. One thing to have a nice shiny policy sitting in the bookshelf or in a file on your computer, but if you're not walking the walk on those policies and procedures, if the staff aren't actually following those, then they're no good. They're only as good as what you're actually doing. And you need to know you need to understand as a practice owner or a practice manager or even an employee, what's the framework that people are working in, and are they actually working to that? As I said, disaster recovery and continuity plans, but where are they stored? If they're stored on your server and you have a loss of server, how do you get access to the plan? If they're stored in a shiny folder sitting in a bookshelf, great. But if the practice burns down and you lose both, where have you got access to that? So it's a matter of thinking about where have we got that stored, who's got access to it, and can we put that plan into play? And again, that'll come out in the templates that we'll provide later. Talking a little bit about the IT consultants or suppliers or managed service providers. Do you use one? If you don't, I would strongly recommend you do, because there's too much to know that you don't know, and that's the problem. I used the example when I did this talk previously. If I need an angioplasty and a stent put in, should I see a cardiologist or should I see my IT provider? I know which one. Or should I see a plumber? It's a specific skill that you need, and you don't know what you don't know. The other thing is, though, make sure you know what your IT consultant is working on, what they're doing, and that you're part of that. You understand the process. You don't have to be an IT expert to understand it, but you should be able to understand what they're doing. So they should be working with you rather than just sending you an invoice every month to say, this is what we've done. You need to understand that. And do you, as a practice manager, know your IT? Do you have access to those administrator passwords? Because if for some reason your IT provider isn't there tomorrow, and you need to access someone else to come in and get access to your system so they can actually get you operating, they need access, and you should have access to those passwords. And if that's not willing to be provided, I usually ask the question, do you work for your IT consultant or do they work for you? Okay, quick scenario breakdown. Looking at this, and I'm not going to go too far into depth. This is just looking at a break-in at a practice, say where you've got an on-premise server. You know, what was the reason behind that? What would be the reason behind that? Obviously, either data theft, looking to get ransom that, or potential fraud. Again, don't aid and abet that by having those passwords available, like our friend in Hawaii. Prevention. What have you actually got in physical prevention? Have you got an alarm? Is it a monitored alarm? Have you got key access? Who's got keys to your practice? If they lose a key, can it be replaced? Can it be cut? Are they restricted keys? Make sure you've got all of those things. Keys should be restricted. Only certain people should have keys. Make sure you get them back when people leave. Server storage, where is it? Is it sitting under a desk? Is it in a room? I know in some practices it's not physically possible to have a server room, but if you've got that option, it should be behind a deadlocked door. As I mentioned, 40% of our respondents in the digital care survey said that they store those passwords. I'd love to see that be a much lower number next time we do the survey. Service level agreements with your IT managed service provider, your IT provider. What is it that they can actually do? Make sure you understand what they can do. If you've got an on-prem server and that goes down, it gets stolen, you have flood, fire, something like that. Can that data be backed up? Can your IT actually reboot you through a cloud environment and actually get you back up and running from your backup in a short space of time? If they can't do that, you really need to be looking at that, because I asked an IT provider a couple of days ago, what's the wait time on a server and what's it worth? About 4 months and $15,000. So your IT provider needs, if you need a replacement server, you need to be able to have that backup in place and running as soon as possible, because I don't think anybody can wait 4 months to see patients. So yeah, what's the likely downtime? Also, what is your business interruption insurance? I know most practices would have business insurance, but what's the interruption insurance coverage there, and what does it cover and what doesn't it cover? Probably more importantly. And then who do you need to advise in the event of that? You know, if it's a break-in, police, obviously your IT provider, potentially us as a PHN, because if we've got that combined knowledge, we can actually start to see if there's a trend happening. And we were aware of that when it happened for those previous 2 break-ins. Your insurance provider, your staff, again, they need to know what's going on, and potentially the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. And I'll cover that very briefly at the end. If you've got a cloud-based server, fairly similar sort of process. The only difference is obviously instead of actually needing a physical server, you've got your cloud-based server that needs to go back up and running. But if you've lost the physical assets within the practice to run those, where are you going to get that replacement IT hardware? Can you get your hands on that quickly in a time frame that allows you to get back and seeing patients in a reasonable time frame? And again, even if you've got a cloud-based server, if you've got your password stuck on your hard drive or on your monitor, you're actually giving away all your access. So make sure that you've got that. Again, those passwords are secure and not visible. Same sort of thing, downtime. What does your business interruption insurance cover? And again, notifications probably going to be the same people. Notifiable breaches. I won't cover this in too much detail. All I would say is, with a notifiable breach, if you've had a data breach, go straight to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. On their website, they've got data breach preparation response. They've got the guide there. Follow the guide, and that will tell you whether you've actually had a notifiable breach or not. You know, the Act says if your organisation is covered by the Privacy Act, you're in health business, you're covered. You need to know what to do in the event of a breach. Whether you've got to advise just the OAIC, you've also potentially got to advise patients and things like that. So it's important to follow that through. I've got some links there to resources. The PowerPoint will come out. You'll be able to get those links, so you don't need to jot those down. That will come out with the presentation. So that's it from me. I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to John, I believe.
Very good. Well, thank you, Peter. That was very informative. And I'm going to have to go through some of those things with a fine-tooth comb. Now I'm just going to bring up my presentation. There, now, Ellen, would you confirm that you can see that? Yep, I'm getting a
I
thumbs
can
up.
see it, Donald. Yep.
Brilliant. Oh, except that's not the beginning. Oh, there we go. Okay, so in the Hunter, when we think of earthquake, of course, everyone immediately thinks of the 1989 Newcastle earthquake, which in fact was one of the worst natural disasters in Australia. 5.6 on the Richter scale, 13 people died, over 160 people injured, 50,000 buildings were damaged. So it was on a very large scale. But we tend to think of that as an isolated event, whereas in fact it's not. We have had lots of much smaller earthquakes in the Hunter, and in fact, if you look at the state map, small earthquakes are in fact very common. So when you're doing your risk assessments for disaster management for your practice, even though you might say, well, a serious earthquake, that is one causing significant damage, is quite a rare event, the consequences are in fact quite major or even catastrophic. So it shouldn't be discounted as something that we don't need to plan for. And I'll come back to this slide a bit later. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through and just ask you all to imagine if an earthquake hits. Now, the nature of an earthquake is just so unpredictable that it's going to happen when you are not at all expecting it. So in the middle of seeing a patient, in the middle of washing your hands or arriving or examining a patient, all of a sudden, violent shaking, the building starts to collapse. There's initial confusion, panic, screaming, hopefully not your own. I guess everyone has their own story for the Newcastle earthquake, and mine was, I was the last member to join the practice and consequently had the smallest room, which was a little lean-to at the back of the practice. And when the earthquake hit, that room shook violently and threatened to collapse. My immediate thought was, this is an earthquake. My second thought was, no, it can't be an earthquake. We don't get earthquakes in Newcastle. The next thought was, well, if it's not an earthquake, it doesn't matter. I've got to get out of this room. It's going to collapse. And I thought, I can't do that. The patient whom I have just finished doing a pelvic examination is just lying on the bed with only a privacy sheet covering her lower half. I can't race out and leave her here, and I can't race out with her. Unfortunately, by the time all those thoughts had passed, the violent shaking had finished, and there was I didn't have to worry about those particular things. So, but the bottom line is there can be confusion right at the beginning. So, what do you do? Well, the CDC in the United States says, drop, cover yourself, hold on to something. If inside, stay away from things that might fall on you, and particularly glass that might shatter and injure you. The scenario where you stand in the doorway is no longer recommended because modern building techniques are not that brilliant for the doors. If outside, keep away from trees, power lines, power poles, etc., etc. So, and then you're left, well, what do you do next? Obviously, you should think about, is anyone injured? And are there any immediate risks? Obviously, building collapse, but there might be electrical wires exposed, there might be fires that start, there might be gas leaks. And one of the first decisions you have to make is, do you evacuate the building? Okay, very reasonable thought, but then who makes that decision? Is that just something that is left at random and everyone just races out of the building, or does somebody actually say, right, we're going to evacuate the building? So, in fact, there needs to be a chain of command. Now, chain of command is very, very important in disaster scenarios because it brings some order to the chaos. And in this scenario, you then have to say, well, you know, who's going to be in charge of this scenario? Should it be the practice principal, the most senior person? Should it be the nominated disaster coordinator? And in answering that, you need to actually look at, well, what should each person be doing? Because each person has a different skill set. there might be a number of people in the practice who can manage first aid, some that can do triage, some whose skill might actually be counting heads, people who are good at organising, but maybe above all, people who are clear-headed in an emergency. So if you do evacuate the building, do you have designated evacuation areas? You will often see that around large businesses, and you might stop and wonder, well, why do they do that? Is that just because that's a safe area? But in fact, if you need to count heads and you need to decide if everyone is out of the building, by marshalling everyone into one area, then you have your best opportunities for deciding who's there and who isn't there. And who in fact does that? I mean, you might think, okay, well, maybe the disaster manager does that, or the principal, but in fact, why not the head receptionist? Because the receptionist is the person who knows who's in the building, who's in the waiting room, who's being seen by their primary health person. But these things should all be decided beforehand. To have to decide on the spot just leaves lots of opportunity for confusion and panic and disagreements. And of course, if you are going to count who's there, then you need to do that immediately because people start to disperse fairly quickly. And you need someone in charge quickly counting everyone, listing who's there. And then, of course, the decision, well, what do you do if somebody is missing? Is a decision made for somebody to go in and search the building while it might be in a precarious state? These can be difficult decisions at the time. And who decides whether the building is safe? I mean, should that be the practice manager, the disaster coordinator? Should it be the practice owner? There's nobody else there at the initial moment to make that decision. And then down the track, if you have evacuated the building, then who decides whether it's safe to go back in? Is it the practice principal? Should it be a builder, an engineer? Does council decide? All of these are some of the difficulties that you may face. And if there are fires, then the decision has to be made, are you going to be able to put them out? So, small spot fires, yes, grab a fire extinguisher and quickly put them out. Of course, that means that you know where the fire extinguishers are. If you just pause briefly and think about your own practice, do you know where all of your fire extinguishers are? Because in an emergency, you don't have the same amount of time to think through clearly. You just need to know. So you think, oh, that's okay. If there's a fire, I'll call the fire services. Well, okay, how are you going to do that? You're going to ring 000. You remember this is an earthquake. If it's a major disaster, then the 000 line is going to be completely flooded. Can your practice have another number for your local fire service? If so, then that needs to be ascertained beforehand and put into your disaster management plan. And what are you going to do if fire services are delayed? Are you certain that everyone is out? Have you done your head count? Have you talked to your receptionist? Have you worked out who was in the building? Have you actually needed to go back into the building and search every room to make sure that everyone's out? Do you pull anything else out of the practice? What about your data server? Should you grab that and run out because it's got all your information on it? And who decides whether this gets done? Okay. And if in a major building collapse, of course, there are electricity wires that become exposed. It might be sparking or might not be sparking and be alive and a major risk. So do you need to turn the electricity off? Or is that just an advisable thing to do anyway once you've evacuated the building? Do you know how to turn your electricity off? There's a picture of our main power board. If you were faced with that, would you know what to turn off? And then what about if the building has solar on top of it as well? Do you know how to turn that solar off? And gas, okay? Should you turn it off? Who makes that decision? Where do you turn it off? How do you turn it off? Do you know where your main gas supply is for your building? And water, again, should you turn it off? It's easy if there's water running everywhere. It's an easy decision. Do you know where in your practice you turn it off? Okay. If you look at if you look at, this is ours, and you say, okay, well, where do you turn off? This is arranged to stop people from tampering with the water supply. So if you're faced with this, how are you going to turn it off? Okay, it's and even if you say, okay, yes, well, I need a spanner or a pair of pliers to turn it off. After you've twisted this 20 times and realised that it's not working, you suddenly realise it's a quarter turn for turning this particular mains off. You really need to know these things ahead of time. Okay, and of course, what if it's night? Or what if you're in the deep, dark depths of a building and the power goes out and you lose lights? You may not be able to see. I've been in this position back in the old Maitland Hospital when GP Access was next to the emergency department. One evening the power went off and I went from in the middle of consulting a patient to absolute complete blackness, literally unable to see my hand in front of my face. So if this happens in your practice, will you be able to find the torches? Do you know where they are? Are the batteries charged? Will you be able to find them? Okay. And does your practice have an emergency kit? Does everyone know where to find them? And in fact, it's one thing for people within the practice to know where all these things are, but what about other people that might come in to try to help and rescue, or patients who are stuck in the building that need to find their way out? So does your practice have an evacuation plan? Does your practice have a map to show where the fire extinguishers are, and where the water services are, etc., etc. Where to turn off the gas, where to turn off the electricity. So once the immediate situation is resolved, you're then left with, well, what now? Should you go and help others nearby? And that seems perfectly reasonable if there are, people in trouble around you. But then in the Newcastle earthquake, when it became apparent that it was a major earthquake and that there were major building collapses in Newcastle, my thought was, well, as a doctor, I should go in there and try and assist. But the reality is that that's not our expertise. Our expertise is in treating injured people or treating people that need medical assistance. But our expertise is not in terms of rescuing people out of buildings that are collapsing. And to try to travel away from your local area means that you're likely to be confronted with roads that are blocked with fallen trees or power lines, etc., etc. And in fact, you may find that you travel to try to assist other people and find that you become of no use whatsoever. Whereas, if you're in the middle of a disaster, in the middle of an earthquake, people are most likely to come to you. They won't be able to get to their hospitals for the same reasons. That traffic jams or roads that are blocked or roads that are torn apart. So they may well be coming to you. So the question then becomes, will you be able to make your services available? And in this scenario also, you need to think, well, are the hospitals functioning? If you've got people with major injuries and you want to get them off to hospital, do you know whether the hospitals are functioning? And how do you find out? Well, certainly, you can't ring 000 because those lines are flooded. Trying to ring the hospital switchboard will be equally disappointing. So you need to then say, well, how would you get that information? And on a bigger picture, in fact, who coordinates health issues in a disaster? So there are well-constructed disaster management plans on a local, regional, and state level, and the coordination goes something along these lines. So when there is a local disaster, then it's the local emergency operation controller who immediately takes charge. Now, this person is typically the senior police officer for that district. Now, he or she will take charge of the disaster management and will be able to direct what are called the combat services, which includes the SES, the ambulance, the New South Wales Police, and both of the fire services. but also he or she is able to direct the HSFAC, which is the Health Services Functional Area Coordinator, which is a person within the local health district, and typically within one of the hospital systems, who is then able to direct the resources from the local New South Wales health resources, such as the hospitals, but can also contact the Emergency Operations Centre at the PHN to then ask for assistance with some of their resources. Now, the Emergency Operations Centre doesn't have a direct relationship with GPs or allied health because we're not employed by the EOC or by the PHN, but in fact, the PHN is able to make contact with GPs as they have a good database and good contacts and nowadays good relationships, and it is in a position to coordinate the general practices and the allied health to provide further services, but not direct in terms of an employer-employee relationship, but able to ask for the services of the primary health workers in an emergency. Also, newly established is a register of GPs who have volunteered to be available in emergencies, and the PHN can activate and contact these emergency GPs to do some of the work. So, don't you love the acronym? The HNECCPHNEOC, which is the Primary Health Network Emergency Operations Centre, is now in a great position to provide information to the primary health workers. That can include what health services are running. It can also track capacity and contact the different practices to work out which ones are open, which ones are available, and maybe even assist them to be open for longer hours, as has happened in some disasters. The EOC can also help coordinate assistance to some of the primary health workers to keep them working or to do extra work. And as I said, can contact the emergency GPs. Okay. So following all of that, you're then in a situation of trying to work out if your practice can continue working, and depending upon the amount of damage and what's involved, there may be all sorts of people that you need to contact. So the state emergency service, if you know the major damage to the building, you may need electricians or plumbers, etc., etc. And of course, to contact these people, you need their phone numbers or contact details, which begs the question, where are those phone numbers or contact details kept? And this is a plug for a disaster plan or a business continuity plan. And this plan should have all the information that is necessary in order for the practice to get back up on its feet. And then of course, when all of the dust settles, we're left with the fact that as general practitioners or other primary health workers, we're left helping all of the people cope. And then we have to think, well, what resources are available? How do we advise people? What psychological services, for example, might be available for these people to help them cope? And this is another area where the PHN can be of use and has been of use in some of the disasters that have happened within our district, particularly the floods to our northwest, and in providing lists of resources that are available for us to help our patients. And then, of course, we hope that with any disaster we learn so that we can manage better next time if it happens again. So establishing a disaster plan is very, very important, and this is one of the primary reasons for this talk, is to encourage every practice to have a disaster management plan and a business continuity plan. But one of the first things to note is that in a disaster, the practice may be called upon to provide more than its usual service. As I mentioned before, the hospitals may not be working, or access to the hospitals may not be there, and so we may be called upon to do more than what we normally do. Okay. And note that we may be required to do that with loss of power, loss of communications, and loss of various other utilities that we normally take for granted. So it begs the question then, have we planned for those scenarios? And this is where the disaster management plan comes in. Okay. For the GPs that are listening to this, I just point out that we are all required to have an emergency response plan or disaster management plan as per the 5th standards from the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. I think that by now most of the practices would have gone through accreditation through the 5th standard, so therefore should have a very good disaster management plan. And if you're not aware of that, then that's a great reminder to get that pulled out so that you can see, because it needs to be something that everyone knows about and everyone agrees upon. Okay. So come back to this earlier slide. When you are putting together a disaster management plan, one of the things to do is to work through a risk assessment for your practice. And one way of doing this is just a risk matrix where you look at each hazard and how likely it is to occur, and then what risk priority do you put that to. So, for example, building collapse outside of an earthquake, the chance of that happening very, very rare, but it can be a major issue. But because it's so rare, I would put that as a low priority for our practice. Communicable disease, so we all know about the pandemic. The likelihood of it happening again is probable, consequence quite high, and therefore that becomes a higher priority for planning. Earthquake, you put that down as being quite rare, but then the consequence can be major or even catastrophic. So that then becomes an important thing to plan for. And for each of these sorts of hazards, and these are all natural hazards that we're looking at here, or loss of utilities, one needs to establish a plan for each one that's relevant. For example, for my practice, there is gas supply to the practice, but because our practice actually doesn't use any gas, gas supply failure, even though it's unlikely, the consequence to us is none. So therefore, we're not planning for that. So, right, and each plan should be based on data that's available that is unique to that practice. For example, this is a vulnerability study for earthquake in the Lake Macquarie Newcastle district. So for practices there, they might want to look at that and then say, okay, well, we're in a high risk area, we're in a low risk area. So each part of the plan is based upon data that's relevant to that practice, because every practice is an individual practice and has different a different set of risks. I'll just use this slide also just to point out, if I were to stop and ask everyone what they thought the worst disasters were, people might say, oh, bushfire or earthquake and whatever. But in fact, the thing that causes most deaths is in fact extreme heat, and this is measured in terms of excess deaths. So the heat waves actually cause more deaths than pretty much all of the other disasters put together. And we don't tend to see that. And I'll just go back. So under heat wave, I've put likelihood almost certain, but consequence to our practice is actually low, because people affected by heat wave typically will present to the hospital rather than to our practice. So things about a business continuity plan or disaster management plan: it needs a planner. It needs someone to be responsible for putting it together and collating all of the information that's required. It needs regular review, because an out-of-date plan is nowhere near as useful as something that is completely up to date. It needs to be agreed upon by all of the people that are relevant within the practice, and it needs to be accessible in a disaster. So Similar to what Peter was saying about your cybersecurity plan, a disaster management plan probably needs to be in multiple locations. If you just keep it within the building, if you have a fire or a building collapse, it may not be accessible. So it needs to be held, at least one copy held outside of the practice, and perhaps also online, which I'll come to in a minute. Now, in terms of putting them together, there are various options. You can roll your own, and there are some templates available to help you with that. The Royal Australian College of General Practitioners has an emergency response planning tool, which they provide as a service. So it's a very good tool. It's very comprehensive. It's provided by them for a fee, which I think is $385 per year. And that means that you can update it at any time. So if anything changes, you can pull up the plan, quickly change a phone number or add something or subtract something, and you can print out a copy from the online record, or print out a number of copies and keep some in the practice, keep some at someone's home, and it is a good system. Akron provides a template for you to use, and I've got a link to that. The PHN has already sent out a template for people to use, so that should be in your email, and that's a really good way of putting together a disaster plan. There are some others scattered around, and I've just added one there that looks quite reasonable, done by Rural Health West, but the one that you've been sent out, I think you'll find is very good. So this is just the college intro page for their ERPT, and this is just reminding that the PHN has a template. I've got a list of resources which will become available for people to see, and again, Akron resources. And that's all I have to say. Hopefully everyone's still there.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. That was a very interesting presentation, walking us through all the different considerations we should keep in mind when an earthquake happens. So it's a very extreme event that causes a lot of different problems. That's why we included it. And also, Peter, thank you so much for your presentation. It shows us that we can only, as non-IT specialists, acknowledge and see the tip of the iceberg when it comes to cybersecurity and possible threats. So it's a very fast-changing environment, and we hope that we could give you a really good overview about the most common threats. So we are very pleased to be able to present this event trilogy to you this winter. We're just picking up the feedback from various primary health providers that they wanted to see more about disaster hazard scenario modeling and business continuity planning. And while we are concentrating on the main hazards that are very likely to happen in the Hunter, New England and Central Coast area, a multi-hazards approach in disaster management also includes the unlikely as well as the very likely or almost certain events. And we try to consider that in all of our planning. So while our PHN business continuity planning template is also a good starting point, I can highly recommend the ERPT tool that the RSCGP developed. Although it's a version you have to pay for, but this tool is extremely complete. It walks you through all hazards that can occur in a practice, and the company also offers user support in filling out the form, regular updates and reviews. So that's just a note on the side. It's definitely good to have some plan than to have no plan. So this is a good starting point for you to take home some lessons, to start the conversation in the practice about hazard modeling, testing your business continuity plan regularly is also very important. So we are excited to welcome you to the next event, which will be on the 15th of August, same time, 6:30. The registration link was not quite ready tonight, but we will send it out to all registered people who joined us tonight and are looking forward to welcoming you again. Topics will be infectious diseases, and we will have the SES talking about floods and tsunamis. So also very interesting evening to look forward to. I will now open the question and answer forum. Phoebe, did you receive questions tonight?
I have only currently received one question. I cannot implore everybody enough to please quickly type your questions through, because our presentations, as Ellen said, were fantastic. And I know that I have a lot of questions, so I'm hoping that everyone else does as well. And please send them through in the chat function now, because we've got everyone on hand to provide you the best information that we can get. John, this one is for you, and it came through when you had your pie chart up, and it's from Raj. So thank you, Raj, for sending this through. And I thought there were more deaths occur from cold, not heat. The graph doesn't mention that, though.
Yes. Raj, I think that's a great thing to point out. I was using statistics that have been provided by the emergency services, and they didn't, in fact, include deaths from cold. A quick search makes it look as though you're correct, and so therefore I thank you very much for pointing that out. The quick search, however, doesn't quite tell me the causes for that, because it looks like the excess deaths due to cold are a lot attributed to influenza and similar respiratory illnesses. So I would expect that once you include excess deaths relating to respiratory infections, that statement is correct, that more people die from cold. If you exclude the respiratory infections, then it may not be the same.
Thank you, John. We have had another question for yourself come through from Brianna. Where is the map, the likelihood of an earthquake from?
Okay, that was a study done, I think, by some engineers. They were looking at structural soundness and the geology of the district. So I can pull up, if you bear with me, I can probably pull up that slide again because it has the link to it on it. Now I'll just to share again, or not share. Let's see, we go. So yeah. Now I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see that well enough. I guess the simple thing for me to do is just to send that link. Just get my pointer back to normal. Not going to let me do that.
John, as this presentation will be shared and uploaded onto our education library, so I can make sure that the hyperlink works, so
yes,
that everyone will have access to that. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. And if I can get my yeah.
Peter, I have some questions for you that have come through. Is there a recommended best antivirus software?
Yeah, no, I can't recommend anything. We've got to stay agnostic on that one. So it really is a matter of looking at seeing what's out there. Talk to your IT provider. They will have one that they recommend. You know, there's various products for various sizes, organisations. So it's really a matter of looking at what's there and working out what best fits here. So we can't give a recommendation on that, unfortunately.
Thank you. Another question, Peter, from Brianna. We use any desk to log on from home. Can you add a password to this system?
I'm not familiar with AnyDesk, but I've just been messaging Jason, and he is. So I'm not sure if Jason's available to jump in and maybe answer that one.
I am.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. Yes, and Indes is just RDP software, so you actually don't use a password to go into that application. The passwords themselves are set at the application end, so the computers you're logging into. What you would check is whether or not, I think there's a free version and a paid version from memory, and generally with the free versions there is, shall we say, lighter security on them. The paid versions tend to have a bit more encryption thrown in, etc., which then obviously presents you a little bit better with, the traffic flowing from your home to the endpoint.
Thank you. I have another one that's come through. There is an increase in demand for referrals and reports to be sent via email from patients, and sometimes copy emails just sent to specialists, especially since COVID. How to minimize the risk of a data breach / leak?
How to minimise? Don't use email. Look, I recognise that a lot of allied health providers and a lot of specialists don't know what they don't know, and they will ask for referrals to be emailed. I would say to you, push back on them. I know that's not always easy. Again, you've got a patient sitting between you and the provider that's asking for it to be emailed. So, look, talk to them about what are the other methods. Have they got something like secure messaging, medical objects? Can they get signed up for sent referrals? If you've got a specialist that you refer to regularly, we're more than happy to get them set up to receive private sent referrals. That's a fairly simple process. So if you've got someone regular, we can set them up. Obviously, that's for the Hunter New England portion of our footprint. But really, all we can do is push back on those providers and look for an alternative method. Because at the end of the day, if there is a data breach, it's not going to be them that wears it. It's going to be you that wears it if the email goes astray or something like that. So, or you have a data breach. So be aware of that. That's probably where it's going to land. So it's a matter of pushing back on them and looking for a secure method to actually get that referral to them. But I recognise, there is a lot of pressure to do that from specialists in allied health.
Thank you. We have a few more. Loving these questions coming through, everyone. Thank you so much. Ellen, I think this one you could help us with. Are the fire extinguishers from Bunnings appropriate for a small practice and fire blankets? Do we need fancier extinguishers?
I would like to refer this particular question to the third of our webinars. I think it came from Brianna, because in the third webinar, we will have the RFS join us, and they will talk about structural fire and risk through bushfire. So they will be the right person to ask. It really also depends on what type of room you have and what you want to put out with a fire extinguisher. So that's something I would like to refer to number 3 of our webinars, if that's okay. Brianna, if
Ellen,
you can't,
make a comment there?
Yes, John?
I think that most business premises actually are required to have fire inspections. And so the people actually doing the inspections would be the people to advise you most of all as to what the requirements are for your particular circumstance.
Oh, good. Ellen, there is one directed at you, so here we go. How many emergency GPs do you have in the PHN? Can the names be shared, and can we encourage more GPs and practices to be involved?
So while this is a database that is not shared because we have sensitive contact details of the providers on there, and it really depends on how the LHD, when they call us for support, how they want to activate this emergency register, if it will be support from within the GP's premises or if a GP will attend an emergency evacuation center. So it's a very it can vary between areas and disaster types. We won't be able to publish that register. However, I can tell you how many we have on there currently. So we have 17 providers on there at the moment, and we will do another round of a call out in September to gain more providers. So hopefully more people will sign up and the register will grow. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Peter, we're coming back to you. I use medical objects to send a referral to specialists. As they were listed, the specialists had no idea how to use the software though.
I don't really know how to answer that. Yeah, look, I think there is, I have heard of that with some software, with some secure messaging providers, that the receiving specialists have got it set up, but they don't know how to access it. If it's set up properly, medical objects should deliver it into their clinical software inbox. So they shouldn't really have to know how to use it. It should just be delivered straight into their clinical software. So that's how medical objects would normally be set up. And if they don't have clinical software, I understand it can be delivered into a desktop folder or something like that. So they just need to go to that folder. That's my understanding. So that's a little bit of a strange one. Do you want me to also address the question about sent referrals availability on the Central Coast?
I was just getting
While
to
I'm on a roll.
Please take it away.
At the moment, we don't have a time frame for sent referrals to become available on the Central Coast. There are some discussions going on in the background. What's happening at a state level? The state is developing statewide referral criteria and a statewide solution that's in development at the moment. So I suppose all we can say is watch this space, but there are things happening to develop a product for the Central Coast and other regions.
Okay. That's all the questions. We've had some resources come through, which is super helpful. Thank you, Katie. I'll make sure that we scoop those up and send them out, or they're attached to the recording of this in our education library. A huge thank you to our presenters again. They have their own jobs that they do 9 to 5, and they do go above and beyond out of their time to not only put together the presentation, but spend the evening with us to present it as well. So we thank you very, very much. We really do appreciate it. We thank you all our attendees. As Ellen said, we will get information for part 2 out to you this week. Thank you for spending your evening and family time and downtime and dinner time with us. We do appreciate that as well. So please look after each other, and thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Oh, only us left now. Now that was very good. Thank you so much. And
It says 16 people still on my list.
Oh yeah. All right.
But that's okay. You can say what you want to say anyway.
That's all right. Yeah, no, that was really good. Looking forward to number 2 and 3, and we will get the registration links out. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. They'll come out this week for sure. The questions really picked up at the end, which was really good to see. I feel like as soon as the first one comes out, people are like, oh, maybe I'll ask a question too, which is great.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question from Raj because, in all my reading, I actually hadn't come across that, but it looks like he's right.
Yeah, let's.
And I think maybe they don't list it under disaster because it's such a seasonal thing. It just happens every year, as opposed to the heat waves, which are intermittent. But yeah. Actually, it reminds me when I worked in Bathurst, just as part of my GP training, the family medicine program, and I remember one stage just doing some early morning nursing home or hospital calls, with one of the GPs there, and I pointed out in the middle of the paddock where there were these very basic looking brick buildings, and I said, "Oh, what are they?" And he said, "Oh," he said, "that was provided. Oh no, we got the council to build those for the homeless people because before they were there, we'd be getting these homeless people sleeping out in the streets that would just die from the cold exposure." And they said these are just basic brick structures with I don't think they had any facilities, but the homeless people could go in there and curl up with a sleeping bag or something, and it would protect them from the extreme weather, because Bathurst is one of the coldest spots in Australia, short of the snowy country. And it saved people from dying, just these basic brick blocks.
Yeah.
I think they just went in there every now and then and just hosed them all out, so
Well, that's a
it's
feedback we can consider for the next round when we do the review of all of our materials and include cold.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Good.
So yeah, I'll
Right.
have to go
Everyone
back.
has left us.
Sorry?
Everyone has
Just us,
left.
yes. Yes. So hopefully I wasn't too monotone on all of that. I thought halfway through I was sounding pretty boring, so I hope I wasn't.
No,
No,
not at all,
not at all.
John. No. It's more that asking the question, what do you do, and reflect on it. That's not monotone. That was a different way of presenting than Peter, but I think it brings a big change into it and keeps it interesting. If not everyone has the same style, so I really liked it, and I already liked it when you had the presentation on in our emergency register event. So that was really good. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I guess all I'm doing is trying to give people the right questions to ask, because you can't give them answers, because they've got to determine the answers for their individual practices, but they've actually got to take time to look through those scenarios and have a bit of an idea of what those scenarios look like in order to know how they would deal with it in their own setting.
We put out the evaluation questions, so we forward all the evaluation reports to you as well. And after we had all three of them, we can look at the change, because we will have some duplicates. Some people will join all three events, or maybe two or only one. And then we can take out the duplicates and look at who had a business continuity plan in place, what preparedness level did they have, what was the evaluation result, and write a short piece about that. I guess that will be very interesting for us presenters as well. So yeah.
So
right.
Do we know how many people were GPs and how many were allied health?
Not at this stage. I will be breaking that apart though.
I don't need it. Just a matter of whether there were various names there I didn't recognise, and so I didn't know whether a lot of people were allied health or not. Anyway.
Good. Thank you so much. And we will see you at the next disaster management meeting, John.
Okay.
And have a good evening. Thank you.
And thank you all, both of you, for supporting this. So it was great.
Oh, good. Thank you, John.
Very good. All right.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye.